Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 517 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, which is available now on Amazon.com. We had a great conversation about the book back in episode 500, so definitely check that out if you missed it. And I want to give a special thank you to Chris Horn, who just gave the book a 5-star review on Goodreads.com. It says, an original and entertaining sprint through fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, full of stories that I found myself thinking about for days after I read them. Each story in this collection provides something original, be that the voice, premise, or a twist on an established trope. The book even manages to say something new and interesting about dragons. Some of the stories take potshots at other properties in the genre, but they are done with a love and understanding of the original that makes them feel like an extension of the conversation rather than a mean-spirited joke. The endings of the stories are particularly strong. You can tell the author spent time thinking about the right way for each one to end, and the effort really pays off. Recommended for anyone who loves intelligent sci-fi and fantasy, but is tired of bloated novels that should be 200 pages shorter. So big thanks again to Chris Horn for that great review. And our guest today is Laura J. Mixon. She's the author of science fiction novels such as Glass Houses, Proxies, and Burning the Ice, and her short fiction has appeared in Asimov's Magazine and in the Wildcard series of shared world superhero anthologies. She wrote her 1997 novel Green War together with her husband, fellow science fiction author Stephen Gould, and she also won the 2015 Hugo Award for Best Fan Writer. And in this interview, we'll be discussing her 2011 novel Up Against It, which was just reissued as part of the Tor Essentials line, featuring a new introduction by James S. A. Corey, author of The Expanse. And now here's our interview with Laura J. Mixon. All right, so we're here with Laura J. Mixon. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Okay, so how did you first get interested in fantasy and science fiction?
I was 11 years old. There was a local library that in the summer I turned 11. I was too young to go into the adult branch, and I'd read all the, it was split into two wings with the adult books and on one side and the children's books on the other side. And they wouldn't let me into the adult side, and I'd already read everything I wanted to in the kids section. And I happened to notice there was this little side area, and it turns out that it had, it had romance, it had westerns, it had magazines, and I knew I wasn't interested in any of those, but it also had science fiction. And so I walked over there, I picked up a book and just started browsing through it, and I was hooked. It was Clifford D. Simak's Ring Around the Sun, and I fell in love.
So what did you fall in love? Like what did you like so much about that book?
Just that it was mind blowing. The concepts were just, so it took me out of myself. It took me out of the world. When I always had a very active imagination as a kid. And this was the first time I ever encountered an actual whole genre that really explored these really deep ideas. And I had a fascination with space already. So I was, all of the spaceships and ray guns and robots, I was a total, sucker for all of that.
And so it sounds like probably you didn't have a lot of friends or parents or who were into science fiction if you just kind of stumbled across it by chance like that, or?
Exactly. My mother was and is a very avid reader, and she loved mysteries. So I had read, mysteries. I'd pick through her books, but yeah. Other than that, that was it. I don't think I actually found another science fiction reader until I was an adult.
Oh, well, so who was the first science fiction reader that you encountered?
Well, actually, it was at Clarion. I first job, completely away from family, small kind of town, very conservative, very, everybody's married. I didn't, know a lot of people, but I decided to sort of keep my sanity. I wanted to take just a community writing class, and they were much more interested in poetry and literary fiction. But a woman who was also taking the class, who was about my age, and I hit it off. And she told me she knew I was interested in science fiction and fantasy, and she wasn't particularly, but because at the time it was not that popular the way it is now. But she gave me this little sort of page out of a magazine that she subscribed to, and it talked about Clarion. And I decided to apply, and I got in. And that was the first time I ever met other people who were as into the genre as I was.
So had you been writing stories and submitting stories, or like how much writing had you done when you went to Clarion?
I started my first story when I was 8. It was a little 4-page, quote unquote, or 8-page novel. And it had illustrations and it had yarn, through the hole punches on the paper. And I was always writing for pleasure, but I wrote my first science fiction right after I discovered science fiction. I sat in that library basically the whole summer and read everything I could get my hands on. And that following fall, when I started school, instead of listening to the teacher, I was writing my book.
So had you submitted anything for publication when you went to Clarion?
Once I submitted a novel that I'd written. It was definitely one of those subset of the million words of crap, but they were actually very kind. They could probably tell I was very young, and they sent me back a note. It was a standard note, but somebody had put a sticky on it. I think her name was like Veronica Nixon, and I think she was interested in the fact that my last name was similar to hers. And she just sort of said, keep it up, don't stop trying. So that was my first submission. But after that, I didn't. I think that was around the time I got out of college, which was when I moved to that small town. So it was very early in my, submission, rejection loop.
So then what was Clarion like? Just like when you think back on it, what was that like as an experience?
I mean, it was challenging in very many ways. I want to say there were 21 of us, 6-week course. And I just, realized that I was among my people. I don't know, there's just something that can happen. It was also the discipline. Like, we were supposed to write a story a week, and I really had difficulty doing that because I don't write short. My short stories very quickly become long stories. So, but it taught me a lot, both about the field, about the craft, and about the business. So that was an incredibly helpful thing.
So, who were some of the people who were there, in terms of the instructors, or people?
Sure. Yeah, the first instructor was Robin Scott Wilson. He was actually I think a literature and writing professor. The second week, I believe I want to say it was Algis Budrys, but it may have been Elizabeth Lynn. And one of them was second and one of them was third, I believe. Fourth was Joe Haldeman, and the fifth and sixth weeks were shared by Kate Wilhelm and Damon Knight, and they were all amazing, actually. Terrific teachers, and just, really great mentors.
Because I've read an interview with you where you said that one of your Clarion classmates kind of introduced you to the New Mexico writers scene.
Yes, Terry Boren, and she is a really amazing writer, actually. Doesn't have a lot out there, but if you ever come across her fiction, I highly recommend it. But yeah, we had been we'd gone to the same high school. She was a couple grades ahead of me. She knew people that I knew and vice versa, but we had just never met. But we became lifelong friends. We're still in touch with each other.
So then what was that like, sort of meeting the New Mexico writing scene?
I had no idea how many. It's kind of like this feeling like when you're alone in the wilderness, right? And you're wandering through the bushes and everything, and all of a sudden you just stumble into this massive beautiful city or oasis. And all of a sudden there are all these people there. It was a really great feeling. I went to Bubonican, which is New Mexico's, one of New Mexico's kind of science fiction conventions. That was my first science fiction convention that year. That was 1981. And then 2 weeks later, I think it was, went to Denvention, which was the 1981 Worldcon. And just, felt like I don't want to say the thing that popped to mind, but I was happy as a pig in shit. But I wish I could think of a better analogy. I was just like a kid in a candy store. There you go.
And so this is like Melinda Snodgrass and George R. R. Martin, and
I didn't meet that group of people until after I came back from Africa. I had, at the same time that I'd applied for Clarion, I'd applied to join the Peace Corps because I was finding that it was really hard to thrive there professionally in the Deep South as an engineer who's, a woman-shaped person. And also, I think I was still looking for myself professionally. I was trying to figure out how to use my engineering in ways that felt closer aligned to some of the things that I wanted to do. And meanwhile, I thought it would be really helpful to me. I'd never, I was born in Roswell, raised in Albuquerque, and had very little exposure to the world other than, family car trips outside of that. And I think Clarion opened my eyes to the fact that, because it had people from, other countries as well as other parts of the country. And I wanted to really know what it was like to live in another country. And I also, that was when Reagan instituted the registration for the draft. And as a feminist, I felt like I should, live my values and do service. So I joined the Peace Corps, and the fall after Clarion, I went off to Kenya for 2 years. When I came back, one of Terry's friends, Walter John Williams, who's also a buddy of mine, introduced me into their gaming group. They had a tabletop role-playing sort of posse that would play different games, and they brought me into that and became close friends with several members of that group.
And so when did you first start getting published?
My first published work was a YA science fiction novel called Astropilots. When I came back from Kenya, I got a job with GE at their aircraft engine machining shop here in Albuquerque. And I think it was Thanksgiving of 1986. I got a really bad flu. And so I had to stay home. And as I started to recover from the flu, I both heard about, because Melinda was friends with Ellen Datlow, who was the acquiring editor for this new YA series they were launching. They were looking for proposals. And all of a sudden, I just had this flash of what I knew I wanted to write. And I sat down and I wrote the first 3 chapters in an outline, and, in just a very short period of time, while I was still sick with the flu, and then into the Thanksgiving weekend, and sent it out. And within a week and a half, 2 weeks, Ellen contacted me and told me she wanted to buy it. It was just like, I was flabbergasted. I never thought it would be like that easy.
Yeah, because it's usually 1 or 2 years, if not 1 or 2 decades, to hear back from a publisher.
Exactly. I think I just got really, really lucky. I had multiple rejections when I was in Kenya of short stories, but nothing really had prepared me for that.
And so when did you meet your husband, Stephen Gould? Was it around that time, or?
A little later than that, and again through Melinda. Melinda was definitely our wampeter. I went to SURCON. I want to say Austin had a SURCON in maybe early 87, like in March of 87 or something. And my friend Terry Boren and I went, and there was a group of people, I think, who went to lunch together, and Steve happened to be there. And I noticed him. We were friendly with each other, but he was involved with somebody else. And then the following fall in Tucson was TUSCON, which was the the non-WorldCon event when WorldCon is international, and that's when I really kind of noticed him a lot. But it wasn't until the following February he came through going skiing. He was on a ski trip, and he was staying with Melinda and hurt his knee and called up and asked me out to lunch. And there was just instant chemistry.
So what was that like, dating another science fiction writer?
I feel like probably the smartest thing I ever did, because we just have so much in common in terms of our interests and our, sort of the meeting of the minds, in addition to, very strong chemistry, physical chemistry, but also just enjoying each other's company and everything. And I think a lot of that was this sort of shared journey that we were on, that, science fiction and the community of science fiction and fantasy readers and writers is just a place where we both feel very much at home.
Because you collaborated on a novel, Green War, right?
Yes, we did. Green War was so my first book, Astropilot, was Scholastic and Omni. And so the first book that the science fiction and fantasy sort of industry that goes to the cons and stuff was really Glass Houses. And that actually did pretty well. So Patrick said he wanted to sign me on another 2-book contract. And one of them we pitched was this collaboration called Green War. And I think it was a really good experience, but we neither of us felt 100% like the book was what we wanted it to be. We had a really hard time with the handoff. It was like each of us has a particular process, and they're very different. And we've both kind of toyed with the idea of going back to it, because there's some really good stuff there, but we feel like there's some kind of major plot issues that we wanted to change. It's not that I think the book, stands up commercially, but I think there were things that we wanted to do with it that we didn't quite pull off back then. So if we ever reissue it, we might actually do a significant rewrite.
Uh-huh. I mean, you mentioned that you had this engineering background. I think it was or sort of became kind of environmental engineering. And so I assume that sort of played a big role in a book called Green War, or?
It did, absolutely. And it was also, and Steve had designed, in fact, because we both have an interest in, how changes to the environment, how people can use technology to respond to that. And so he had designed an offshore platform for using, the temperature difference between the surface of the ocean and the depths of the ocean to drive a heat engine. And we decided we wanted to use that as a centerpiece. So that was his baby, but there's a lot of stuff about the environmental business and sort of the conflicts between corporate, profitability and environmental law and an emerging technology and so forth. So, yeah.
Yeah. And when you say, that you pitched this to Patrick, that's Patrick Nielsen Hayden, right?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, that's correct. Patrick Nielsen Hayden is my editor at Tor.
Uh-huh. When you said the Glass Houses did well, like what I haven't read that one. So what was that about?
Well, it was a cyberpunk nearish future set in New York, climate changed New York. a young woman, a scavenger who uses teleoperated machines to scavenge in areas of the city that, have been harmed or, degraded by both climate change, and also there had been a terrorist attack in New York. This is really interesting. It came out in 1992, but and so she basically discovers a man trapped in a former skyscraper that's really deteriorating, and she was going in there to basically get into the vaults and see what she could get in terms of stuff that might be marketable but she finds this man who's trapped, and she says, well, you really need to get out of here because it's not safe for like a human body to be in here. And while they're talking, basically the roof collapses. And she finds that he's got this envelope. He was trapped there due to the storm. And he was on the way to a meeting with his son, and he had this envelope. And the envelope had his latest will, and it had some diamonds, and she basically steals the diamonds. And then she gets caught up in this whole intrigue in that family, and, hijinks ensue.
So in 1991, were a lot of people doing climate change science fiction, or were you kind of ahead of the curve there?
Yeah, I would say, ahead of the curve. There was none of it. In fact, I think I didn't start seeing that climate change stuff for another 10 or 15 years. Well, I will say Kim Stanley Robinson, his Pacific Coast trilogy, that's probably the first thing I remember reading and that came out around that time, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Is the title Glass Houses, is that a reference to the greenhouse effect, or?
It was partially, and also it reflects the theme, about people living in glass houses, and it just sort of also had to do with Ruby's sort of psyche. She was she had agoraphobia, and she was afraid of other people. She didn't like being seen, so there was this sense of having to be willing to put yourself out there and be seen.
Uh-huh. And then you published two other books that you published were Proxies and Burning the Ice. And
that's correct, yeah.
Sort of, what sort of sticks out about those books for you?
Well, Proxies I started when I was in Kenya. We were house sitting for an expat, a friend of mine and I, another Peace Corps volunteer, and he had this magazine. It may have been even like Popular Mechanics or something, but in that magazine was an article about telepresence, and I think that just really grabbed my imagination. So I had this image of a man looking down in basically an android body, looking down at himself in a crypt or a coffin or something. And that drove the whole story of Proxies. But it took me 14 years to write. And while I was writing it, I wrote Glass Houses as kind of like another person in that universe, in that milieu. So they're loosely connected trilogy, but the same idea of telepresence and technology expanding our consciousness and our sense of self.
So why did it take 14 years to write Proxies?
Because it was very ambitious, and it took me a while. I was learning how to write that as I went. It's a multi-viewpoint story. It has the first character you meet has amnesia, and it turns out that person is actually one of three personalities that occupy the same body, but they all that person is a young man who has been trained to split his basically his consciousness. He has essentially multiple identity disorder, but it was induced so that he could control different proxy bodies at the same time. And one of them actually is a woman, and she is one of the main characters of the book. But, that's a challenging thing to write and probably to read. But I do love, I have a lot of fondness for that book. There's lots of skullduggery. There's a secret group that's trying to steal the first starship and people trying to stop them, and got all kinds of stuff going on.
And then how about burning the? I think I read it's in like an exosolar planet or something.
No, that's correct. 47 Virginis, I think. I posited, this was back before we had a lot of information on exoplanets, that there was a gas giant around that star, and that gas giant was within the Goldilocks zones and its moon. Some of its moons were habitable, so they were colonizing and terraforming one of its moons. And turns out that the starship that came there, that was a generation ship, was the same ship that was, the center of proxies, and a whole bunch of more intrigue stuff comes out there too.
So did you have to do a lot of research? Like, since you had this background in environmental engineering, I guess writing stuff on Earth, you kind of had an expertise in that, but did you have to do a lot of research when you started writing about stuff going on elsewhere in the universe?
Well, yes, for sure. But I'm very fortunate to have lots of smart friends who really helped me. Probably the person that helped me the most was Chris Crawford. He's a renowned game designer, and we became good friends. But he's also a physicist, and he helped me a lot with the physics of the orbital mechanics that I needed for that story. But the environmental stuff really was just an extension of, in many ways, of the kind of work I do, or did when I was still working as an engineer, here. So I'd always had a fascination with, astrobiology and things like that. So I just kind of did a lot of reading to try to be, my philosophy as a science fiction writer is, I have a range of likes, right? Don't like to be pinned down, but I'd say when I'm reading science fiction, one of the things I can really get into is stuff that's got a lot of scientific grounding. But I also like when writers surprise me, and I like space opera, I like these other things, but when I write it, I like to sort of delve into that challenge of how can I make this believable, but really still blow the reader's mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've always been into science fiction and fantasy and everything, but I've gotten more and more into science fiction set within the solar system. Like, I still like stuff that's in outer space, but, without the faster than light travel or time travel or anything like that, that just seems more like it could actually happen.
Yes. I like playing with that too. That was a big thing for me with Burning the Ice. I did cheat though. I did have instantaneous communication, and sort of an Ansible type thing that enabled people to control telepresent bodies, but I didn't enable them to contact Earth because the power of the signal would just be too great. So I waved my hands at that and decided I wasn't going to try to put that in the story. Too much else was going on. But yeah.
Well, right. I just read your novel Up Against It, which does take place just in the solar system. And so could you just talk about how'd that book come about?
Oh, gosh. I really surprised myself. I found when I was looking back, I thought I had started the book, sometime in the mid-aughts, but I found a very early draft, just a very short snippet that was actually started on January 1st, 2000. So I after I turned in Burning the Ice, I was definitely thinking about, what was happening back in the solar system of the future of glass houses and proxies and Burning the Ice. But I rapidly decided I did not want to have an Ansible, so forth. And so the notes that I had taken about what was happening back on Earth and some of the characters that I had originally planned to use the Ansible, right, and to have a character back in Earth space or in Mars space or whatever, communicating with my character around this gas giant. But it just got way too separated. The stories diverged from each other. So I sort of had to do surgery and pull that out. So I took that material and I just completely remade it. And that served as the starting place for Up Against It.
I guess I should explain. So the story is set on 25 Phocea, which is an asteroid in the asteroid belt.
Mm-hmm. And in my series, and I do actually plan to write a couple other books in that series, it's like, I guess I want to say almost 400 years in the future, maybe almost 300 years. It's right around that time frame. And the solar system is settled, but the the mass of humanity really lives in Mars space and Earth space. And others are, it's scattered throughout the asteroid belts. There's, some settlements around the moons of Jupiter. There are outposts in other parts of the solar system. I had plans for working on some stuff with Venus, but I don't really have it sketched out very well yet. But I kind of wanted to do something with the cloud cities of Venus. But anyway, this Earth is undergoing. It has been preserved. People try to take resource extraction from other parts of the solar system now that energy is plentiful because they've mastered fusion. So they basically toss. They have this thing where they go out. They have little von Neumann machines going out there and prospecting and tossing ice down from the Kuiper belt, and it's primarily methane ice, although in some cases like Mars, once maybe some more water ice, they would order it. And so, it sort of gets trafficked at the orbit of Jupiter, and it gets sent into different places in the inner system, including the asteroid belts. And a massive methane shipment, which is what my folks on 25 Phocea use to survive, is just destroyed almost immediately after being delivered. And it turns out it was sabotage. And my main characters, who come from different walks of life, sort of have to figure out how to work together against this threat.
Well, right. So let's talk about the main characters. So there's sort of two main characters in the book. So there's Jane, who's sort of an administrator on the asteroid, and then there's Jeff, who's kind of a rowdy teenager. So kind of how did you settle on them as your protagonists?
Well, initially, I was trying to do it as a solo viewpoint from Jane's point of view. And I found that there were so many things that had to happen that she simply couldn't really be privy to, that it really needed to be a multi-viewpoint book. And so I came up with Jeff Ager, and this is a young man whose father really doesn't know how to be a dad, and his older brother is like the golden one, right? He's the hero, performing perfectly, getting good grades and everything, and Jeff just sort of turns out rebellious, just in opposition to that, to try to get his dad's attention, probably. But anyway, when his brother is killed in the explosion at the warehouse, when the ice all goes up in vapor, and suddenly he's thrust into this place where he can't just sort of do whatever he wants, right? There's not room for him to be a rebel because there's this crisis, and he's sucked into the middle of it because Sean, who I also consider a pretty major character, he's not really a protagonist, but I'd say he's a really important character, and there's going to be more about him. Is the guy who manages the kind of the warehouse shipments and stuff like that and logistics. He sort of takes the boy under his wing a little bit, and also asks for his help with the different things. And so Jeff and his friends, respond to that. And meanwhile, Jane's being sort of a Cassandra. She, earlier in her career, she's 89, which is middle age because of longevity, technology. But she really experienced a traumatic event on Vesta, if I'm remembering correctly, where the Martian syndicate wants to control those traffic lanes for the resources that are going into the inner system, both the stuff that's being mined in the asteroid belts and also the stuff, the methane and water ice that's necessary for so many different things going on to help make Mars more of a power, power nexus than it can be now because it's still pretty dependent on Earth. So basically, and also an AI, a feral AI, a feral sapient, is spawned in the warehouse servers when it's trying to respond to this crisis, this explosion, and then they have to also deal with that. And the AI is sort of trying to figure out what the heck is going on. But yeah.
I really like that term feral sapient. Like, do you remember where did that come from?
I just remember that's what sprang to mind when I thought about this being. I wanted it to feel like not just sort of artificial intelligence feels like, oh, it's not really, a sapient or a sentient being. So, and also because, all of my characters in a way were sort of feral sapients. I remember my initial scene, the first scene I wrote was actually from Jane's perspective when she's swinging out on the vines, right? They have these tethers, which is one way that they can travel among different asteroids because they're all moving in different orbits. You can't connect them. There are 3 that are strung along in the same orbit, and they've got, they use ion, correctional jets to keep them aligned. But the rest of it is there's these what I call treeways, which are these rigid cables that span out from the cable between those 3 or among those 3 asteroids. So because asteroids are really very far apart, whenever you see in the movies, like they have all the asteroids clustered together, that's not the way it really looks. But people do live out there, and so if they're within range of the treeways, then they can tether out to the treeways and then make their way back, sort of jet packing it back to the main cities.
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing I thought was really cool is that people in this society, sort of like a rite of passage almost, is that they'll go all the way around the asteroid belt, and this takes 13 years or something. It's a big expedition. Yeah, and particularly because people live longer, people feel like they can afford to do that, right? And it's sort of like the people who climb Everest. Only I think there's a little bit more of a like you're not really a asteroider unless you can, say that you've done this. Yeah, but I really liked this dual, these dual protagonists of Jeff and Jane because, with Jeff you have more of the sort of action adventure kind of, physical danger kind of stuff, and with Jane you have this really interesting, adult challenges of, managing groups of people and navigating political situations and stuff like that. So I thought it gave a really nice balance to the book.
Thank you.
It was making me think of like Foundation or Cities in Flight by James Blish. These books where sort of the mayor of a city basically is the hero of the science fiction story.
Yes, I've always liked stories with. I like stories where you have sort of unexpected people stepping into a role where they have to really respond to this huge challenge that they had no idea they were going to face. I think that's true of both Jeff and Jane. They both get thrust into this, like, Jane was used to dealing with she had to make some tough calls sometimes. She had to work really hard to make sure all those connections got made and everybody got the resources they need, because of literally life and death, right? But she'd never had, a crisis of this magnitude, except for that time back on Vesta, where she nearly died and she became essentially a refugee until she settled, met Juan and settled on 25 Lucia. So yeah, I like Every Man and Little Taylor stories. I do enjoy people having to figure out how to be clever and overcome, these tremendous obstacles.
I was curious with this character whose her title is like Commissioner of Resource Management or something, and I was just wondering if you felt like you were drawing on your experience in the corporate world in any way for this character.
Yes, absolutely. I would say very much so. I've had a number of roles where I first probably, I was at GE for a while, and then I went into environmental consulting, and then I got headhunted for this fancy schmancy role on Wall Street, where they actually made me a corporate officer of an investment bank that had a commodities arm, and they had all kinds of environmental liabilities, and it was a real eye opener. I mean, I was literally reporting to like the CFO and the chief legal counsel and giving briefings to the CEO, and it was just such a different world. It was like, but everybody's just people, right? So they were acting like just people, but they weren't like paying attention to some of the larger issues that were really going on. And that's one of the reasons I didn't stay in the job, actually. It just felt like I felt like I was doing some good environmental work there. And I did have a couple of people that I worked for and with that were very supportive of that, but it was really just nibbling around the edges of this massive resource exploitation machine. And I think sort of Jane's regrets about her past, and sort of having to deal with all of the political machinations and how to get things achieved when people might have very different agendas than yours, very much influenced up against it.
It was funny, because I attended the Viable Paradise Writers Workshop back in 2004, and you were one of the instructors. And so just as I was reading this book and reading about Jane feeling that she's, being sort of set up, or people are out to get her, or, put the blame on her and stuff, this memory popped in my head where the way I remember it is you said, I don't know if it was this position you're talking about or not, but the way I remember it is you said that basically you were in this position and you realized there were kind of like shenanigans going on, and that they had basically put you in this position specifically to blame you when things inevitably went south.
Oh, well, that was really that was a general statement. I was making a joke, but there was a grain of truth to it. I think that I said that they probably hired me to be the designated felon.
Yeah.
I wasn't totally fair, because my boss was really great. Don Howard, he was very much he hired me because of my community service in Kenya. He was very, he had a bunch of lawyers working for him who, when dealing with these Superfund sites and other contaminated sites that the company had inherited when it bought this commodity trader, he had to set the reserves. There's, a whole process that's required by financial law where you have to set the amount of reserves that it's going to take to clean up these sites. And so he hired me, I think, because he knew I was really going to give him the straight goods, that I wasn't going to try to say, oh, we should just not worry about that, or, we can delay and stall, and, we won't have to pay all of the fines and blah, blah, blah. I really gave it to him straight, and he really appreciated that. But it was definitely cowboys. They called themselves Big Swinging Dicks. That was the ambiance, the traders and everything. They were very much pretty, whatever we can get away with is okay. But they were mostly focusing on, treasury bonds. And there was a huge scandal about a year and a half, I want to say, after I started working there. And it nearly took the company down because there's a requirement that the investment bank can't buy more than a set percentage of bonds from the government for its own accounts. And above that, it has to be for their clients. So basically, this one trader just lied, and management found out he lied and then covered it up and didn't report it to the SEC. So Warren Buffett ended up, they stripped off the whole layer of management, except for Don Howard. And when Warren Buffett came in, was interim CEO. It was just a huge, huge scandal. So, and then what caused me to finally leave was I made a lot of progress. I got an environmental policy. I advocated for that, and we got an actual environmental policy in like 1992 or 3. One of the first, investment banks that actually committed itself to, and was signed by, the CEOs of both the parent and the investment bank, and an energy conservation and recycling program, and all these things that I managed to accomplish that I felt really good about. And then I walk into a meeting with these two investment bankers, and they're just talking about this great deal that's about to happen with Georgia Pacific and some other, and they're getting funding for it, and it's for a massive operation to clear cut Indonesian rainforest. And I just sat there and I thought, I have no leverage. There's nothing I can do to stop this. I have no power over this. And this is their main business. And I realized that I really felt like I was being complicit by staying there. So that was pretty much when I decided I had to leave.
And then you can write science fiction novels where you can make anything happen you want.
Exactly. And deal with, because I do think that storytellers are a really important part of bringing about the futures that we want to see. You have to be able to imagine it before you can do it. So I wanted to write stories about that.
Yeah, I mean the acknowledgments page of this book, it's a real who's who of people. I mean, you've got like George R. R. Martin, Jane Lindskold, Ellen Kushner, and Delia Sherman, Melinda Snodgrass, Nowell Hopkinson, Walter John Williams. You want to just talk about sort of how all these people sort of helped you get the book into its final form?
Well, in a number of ways. They either helped me with some of the research and some of the world building, and or they read my book and were beta readers and gave me critiques that helped me, improve, help me improve the book. And, we're just really good moral support, trying to keep me going. Writing a book is a long and lonely process. And but primarily they were giving me very practical things.
Yeah. Well, how about this thing? It says, David Porterfield gave me assistance with the business and technology of mining and let me fire his awesome Spud launcher.
Oh, yes. He was a client of mine, actually, and he became a friend. So one of my clients was, when I came back to pay the bills and keep the lights on, I went back to environmental engineering consulting, and one of my clients was a mining company, BHP Billiton, and David Porterfield was my main contact. And so a lot of the mining details, he was, very happy for me to sort of like interview him and get, and gave me information about, just the kinds of challenges that miners face on Earth, and helped me sort of speculate what would it be like in a zero G or low micro G environment. And and the potato guns. I told him that I wanted Jeff and his friends to have, something plausible but funky, weird, to fight off the baddies when they get cornered in Jeff's little plane. And he told me about potato guns, and he said, I actually have one and we can go out and fire it. And it was loads of fun. But he also, he just let me handle it. He let me shoot it. It was really cool.
And so he just has like a big backyard or something? You can just fire it off into the...
Well, this was out in Four Corners, New Mexico. So we went out into
in the desert.
The wilderness. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not desert really. It's hill country there. Transition zone hill country. I'm being a nerd. I'm sorry. But anyway, but we were shooting it. We were on a low rise and we were shooting it out across the valley, and it was fun. Those things go really far if you have them set up right. It's got a lot of punch behind it.
Yeah. That's really cool. Actually, speaking of New Mexico, it was kind of interesting because I just went back. I interviewed Stephen Gould back in episode 116, and so
Ooh.
I was just curious. I went back and listened to it last night, and I'd asked him about New Mexico because I said, growing up, my favorite author was Roger Zelazny, and so I always wanted to go to Santa Fe, and because that's where he lived. So
yeah.
And so Steve sort of told me a little, and I'd never been to New Mexico at that time. And it's just funny because what's happened subsequently is my girlfriend and I took a road trip to California last summer, and we met up with Melinda Snodgrass and Jane Linsgold along the way, and we just had a great time. And we had such a great time that we went back for Thanksgiving, and I actually proposed to her on the road.
How sweet. That's... Well,
the road leading up to the ski basin overlooking Santa Fe, because it's a location in one of the Roger Zelazny's Amber books. So I thought that would be a cool place to do it.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I love Roger Zelazny's work. We lost him way too soon.
Right, because when in this interview with Steve, he said that he never really met Zelazny. He said actually that Zelazny was supposed to come to your house, I think. But, right before he went into the hospital. But he said that you knew him longer. So I was just curious if you had any...
Yes, I wasn't, we were friendly acquaintances. I just think he was a terrific guy. I mean, he was brilliant. And we would often see each other at gatherings with other writers, but people like Jane and Melinda and George and so forth really knew him best. But I, never missed a chance to sit down and talk with him. He was a very humble man, and he was a brilliant man. He just always had these great insights.
Yeah, that's really cool. It actually says on here that you collaborated with Melinda on a story.
Yes. Oh, Melinda is such a terrific person to collaborate with. She and I collaborated on a wild card story back in, I want to say that was 1991, maybe 1992.
It says 94 on
94,
Wikipedia.
Really? Okay. Well, I remember it was in that 5-year stretch when Steve and I lived in New York City. So it must have been later. Yeah. That's right. I had written another story for Wild Cards, for the first story of the Card Sharks trilogy, on my own, and that was a little bit earlier. And then Melinda and I collaborated on the Card Sharks story back. I must have been in 94.
So what was that process like, the collaborative process?
It was interesting because at the time, if I'm remembering correctly, she was in Hollywood, and so she was like swamped with all of her daytime responsibilities. And Steve and I had a baby at that time, our older child, and I was working at Salomon, that Wall Street firm, and so it was like we were tossing it back and forth to each other, with our two different viewpoint characters. But we had a blast with it.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if we should explain. So Wild Cards, it's a shared world superhero anthology series that Melinda and George R. Martin do. So, do you want to say like what was that story about? Like,
sure. So, well, the series starts in 1947 when an alien race drops a bioengineered virus in New York. And you have basically a 90% chance of dying. You have a 9% chance of being basically having your body just changed in some way that is non kind of standard human. So you can become like a blob, you can become a a giant snail, you can become anything, right? But you don't have powers. But the lucky 1% end up with superpowers. And that was the reason these aliens who are biologically similar to humans, the Takesians, Melinda's creation, created that virus. They were basically releasing it on a vulnerable population in order to see what would happen. But the virus is a retrovirus, and it can become inheritable. And so succeeding generations in the succeeding books, I want to say I don't even know how many books there are by now, at least 30. And there are 30 to 40 writers. And so each book is might have 7 or 8 writers, and then someone who writes the frame for the book. And typically they're sold in trilogies. So you'll have 3 books about a particular plot arc. And books 12 through 14 were called the Card Sharks. And it was basically about a plot by this secret society to commit genocide, basically, to eradicate anybody with a wild card trait. And so my first story was about a dilettante, basically a debutante and dilettante who marries the guy who's kind of at the center of a lot of these machinations. And then her card turns, and she becomes a Lamia. And she has been previously very bigoted against wild carders. So, and her husband is planning this campaign of genocide against them. So she has to get out of Dodge, and she has to leave behind her baby daughter, who's raised by this maniac and completely sort of cult brainwashed, and grows up to be this. And she is also autistic, this young woman. So she grows up to be this really brilliant scientist, and figures out how to target the wild card, gene modifications directly with the virus that basically kills people with the wild card virus and nobody else. And then all of a sudden, when she's going to introduce the virus, she's part of that plan. She meets and falls in love with the Joker, which is Melinda's character, who's a centaur. And then she has to sort of try to frantically work with, her lover to undo what she had set into motion.
Yeah, so that sounds like a lot of fun to work on that series.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
What was the response like to Up Against It? Because it's just been reissued as a Tor Essentials, so it seems like it got a pretty good response.
It did, but it was delayed, and we think that was because there was this long lag while I was working, where my writing output was very slow. It took about 6 months or so for my readers to find it, because I'd used MJ Locke, sort of reintroduced me into the field, and then it got some really good attention, and it got some good sales. But I think Patrick felt like it really should be getting more notice, and I think that's why he did it. And I also am very lucky just to have had friends with higher profiles who really liked the book and promoted it. And I think that's sort of that the Tor Essentials line is really, it's about, keeping works that Patrick and has a sense that is, going to be something that readers would enjoy, and we should keep in print in paperback form.
Yeah,
so I just feel very fortunate that I was picked for that.
Yeah. So it's out now. I mean, it looks really cool. It's under your name, Laura J. Mixon, and it's got a introduction by James S.A. Corey. So it's a really nice looking new edition.
Thank you. I love it. The first time I got my copy, I just ran my fingers over the surface. and beautiful artwork. I really love. I love the cover design.
Yeah. So you said that you have some like sequels or something in the works, or?
Yes, I have. I have 2 books that I want to write, following up against it, that are going to follow the same characters, maybe some different sort of emphasis, different viewpoints, but that are going to basically widen the lens a little bit on these kind of power struggles in the solar system between these different groups of people. And the AI is obviously going to play a role too. In some ways, I think of the story, among other things, as my Bitman Singer's coming of age. So I've got those sketched out. But while I was waiting for the contract for those 2 books, I started working on another book, which I loosely thought of as a prequel. I don't know if I'm going to directly try to tie it, but it kind of deals with not exactly the same themes, but the idea of kind of much more near future, like 30 years in our futures, with a U.S. Chinese space race to Mars and some young people who get caught in the middle of a big political struggle.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And like I said, like I've really been into lately these things like The Expanse, where that's, sort of near, like outer space, but near future and more scientifically grounded. So I'm always looking for more books like that.
Yeah, I love the Expanse books. I think they're terrific. It was really funny that that Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank are the writers behind James S.A. Corey, and they're buddies of mine. And for a while, I actually was in the same workshop with them. But by the time I was really into and working on up against it, I just didn't have time to go to a workshop. It was the work and the right in the crannies. So there was no real overlap at all, but it was fascinating to me. Their book came out just 2 months after mine, and the similarities were pretty striking.
Yeah. They note in the intro that you were both writing these books. The Leviathan Wakes and this were being written in the same city at the same time. It's kind of a funny coincidence.
Yeah, very much so.
All right, great. So we're pretty much out of time. Do you have any other final thoughts or any other projects you want to let people know about?
Well, I do. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is I do have another wildcard story up. I'm pretty pleased with it at Tor.com. It's called Ripple Effects, and it's about one of the cast of American Hero, which was a reality TV show in one of the trilogies that was written back in the aughts. Where they basically had to compete. The different heroes have to compete for the prize, but it turns out some of them get sucked into a war instead. But I had a minor character, very minor walk-on character in the first book of that series, and I decided I wanted to develop him. So he's the protagonist of a novella that I wrote that was a lot of fun to write. So if you like superpowers that are more scientifically grounded in a way, although they really do have flights of fancy as well, but it feels more like what I think of as science fiction or speculative fiction than strict comic book superhero stuff, which I also like. But if you like that kind of stuff, I think it's a good story you might enjoy.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So it's called Ripple Effects, and it's up now on Tor.com.
That's correct.
All right. Yeah, I will definitely check that out. And yeah, so we're out of time, so why don't we start wrapping things up there? So we've been speaking with Laura J. Mixon about her novel Up Against It. So Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
David, thank you for having me. This has been a blast.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Laura J. Mixon for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.